Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joshua Schumann from the Schechter Institutes of Jewish Studies. We welcome all of you. Please try to keep your microphones on mute. We welcome back again all of you to meet with Professor Ed Greenstein. He's a Professor Emeritus of Biblical Studies at Bar Ilan University. Earlier, he was professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and at Tel Aviv University here in Tel Aviv. Professor Greenstein has published widely in biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies. His annotated translation of Job in 2019 won wide acclaim, and we're using that as our text. He is currently writing a full commentary on Job and several other books. Professor.
Well, good day, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And I know that there are people all the way, from California to Israel with us today. I want to wish everybody who is a father or who has a father or who had a father a happy Father's Day. You should have good experiences and good memories. Before we get started um, into today's session, which will deal with Job's lawsuit against God, first I want to show you um, what I think is an image that will, that is about as close as we can get from the ancient world to what the Satan was imagined to look like. Okay, so I'm going to share with you this. There you go. Handsome fellow, no? Can you see it? Yeah. Okay, so you remember that the Satan would scoot about the land on Earth very fast, and you wouldn't even notice him, but you might feel a kind of breeze go by, and the Satan would spy on you and find everything wrong with what you're doing, and then go up to the heavenly council and report to God. And so you might get punished for something that you did, and not even realizing that you did it. Now, the Pazuzu is actually not the exact equivalent of the Satan. The Pazuzu was a demon who you turn to in order to protect you from other demons. But I think the idea that he has a kind of human form and that he has these wings, as you can see, not exactly your image of an angel from the Western tradition. So I thought anyway that you might like to get a look at this. Okay, this is an ancient Mesopotamian statue. It's not a modern sculptor's vision. Okay, now I got a number of comments last week. A few of you wrote to me, and several people made comments on the chat. And so I'm going to try to respond as briefly as I can to um, these comments. This will take just a few minutes. Today we're going to try to collect chat questions and comments and deal with them at the end of today's session. But if we don't succeed, we'll do our best to collect them and deal with them at the beginning of the next session, which is next week. Okay, now, Leibniz, the philosopher from 17th century, um, explained that if you want to maintain that there is God and there is evil in the world, right? You can't maintain everything you'd like to admit about God. You can't say God is omnipotent, all powerful. And also that God is omniscient, all knowing. And also that God is omnibenevolent, benevolent. Because if God only wants to do good, and God knows everything that's going on, and God can do anything God wants to do, then how do you explain that there's evil in the world? So you have to give up something. When I've given courses and lectured on the problem of evil in the Bible, I've maintained that in every biblical story where the problem of evil, innocent suffering, comes out, um, one of these three claims about God is compromised, not necessarily given up entirely, it's not totally surrendered, but compromised. For example, God isn't omnipotent necessarily. That is usually not given up. God is omniscient. Well, God is not always omniscient. And in fact, in the book of Job, in the tale that opens the story, God tests Job. And when you have a test, it means that God doesn't really know the answer. God is not sure. God has an inkling, God has an expectation, but God doesn't really know. There's a nice little Hebrew book written by Yaakov Licht, who was a professor at Tel Aviv University. He was the leading in his day. He was the leading professor of biblical studies at Tel Aviv University. He wrote a little book in Hebrew called Hanisayon, the Trial, which deals with the Bible and also early Jewish tradition. And he points out very directly that in a story like the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in the story of Job, and also in the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, where the Israelites are put to a test. We looked at that a little bit last week to see if they would remain faithful to God throughout the wilderness journeys. In each of these cases, God is not certain how it will end. And in the case of Job, God also is not certain how it will end. But of course, God wants Job to be completely loyal, loving, and devoted. Whereas the Satan, the adversary, raises questions about whether it makes sense for a person who's been blessed with everything to be loyal to God, to be reverent, without any expectation of blessing or reward. Okay, so that's my answer to those people who ask about um, whether there's a questioning of God's omniscience. I think there is an assumption that God doesn't know everything. Yes, you look at the end of the book, God knows all about the mating habits of the animals, right? God knows about lots of things in nature, but God doesn't really know how this particular human being, Job, who he thinks will behave as righteously as possible, right? But he isn't really sure whether this person, uh, is indeed completely faithful to God. Okay, so God may be all powerful, but not all knowing. Someone asked about how blessing God can also be interpreted as cursing God. And last week, I think I did show you a case in the story of King Ahab and Naboth's or Naboth's vineyard, where um, the king Ahab wants this property that's near his, and he's very upset because Naboth won't sell to him, and his wife Jezebel, Phoenician princess, tries to come to the King Ahab's aid, and she does this by finding some witnesses who will falsely incriminate Naboth or Naboth of uh, cursing God and king, which is a capital crime. And the word for cursing is blessing. Now, we don't really know whether it was an ancient scribe, the original scribe who used this euphemism, or whether it was a scribe who transmitted the text, who introduced the euphemism. I'm assuming it was the original scribe. That is, that this was a euphemism going way, way back. Okay. Someone asked about whether the sacrifices that Job made might have been in Thanksgiving for the birthdays of his children, but I'm pretty sure that it's explicit in the story of of Job in chapter 1, that he makes these offerings because he's afraid that someone might have cursed God in their hearts. Of course, he wouldn't think that his children were so ill-bred that they would do something blasphemous or unseemly outright, but that in their hearts uh, they might have had a bad feeling, and when they were tipsy, with drink. And so um, so Job would make sacrifices to atone for them in advance, although these atonements didn't protect the children from being killed off in the second round, the last round of the first set of catastrophes. Okay, now someone asked about the negative nuance of Job's protecting his kids. Yes, there is a negative nuance here. There's also a negative nuance in the popular saying that is somewhat enigmatic that the Satan uses to explain to God that he's really got to affect Job in Job's body. You've got to hit Job himself. Skin for skin. What does exactly skin for skin mean? So I interpret it in two different ways. Either it means that a person will do what he has to do to protect himself, and he will be ready to sacrifice all the things that are around him, or it'll mean more or less the same thing, but in a somewhat different interpretation of the Hebrew, that there's skin under the skin. In other words, you can affect someone on their epidermis, right? That is everything that surrounds that person. But until you hit the person down to the bone, down at the core, you're really not going to be getting a response. Then there was a question about the formation of the book of Job in the Persian period. Um, how fast did it happen? Okay, my assumption is that there was a prose tale of Job. I'm going to go into this a little more detail than last week, but not a lot. Okay, that there was a prose tale of Job based on a legend of Job, and that this prose tale had a certain form, and then in the Persian period, somebody added a second layer to it, which included the Satan, because the Satan, we know, comes out as a character, a person, so to speak, only in the Persian period. In the book of Zechariah, chapter starting with chapter 3. He's also mentioned in the book of Chronicles. I'm going to say a word about that as well. But what I might have done last time was to sort of mislead slightly that the Satan, right, is not necessarily claiming that Job is evil or that Job is really bad, but he just doesn't really know. And I also said that that Job that I'm sorry, the Satan was a way of removing bad things from the direct activity of God, the direct agency of God. And that is true in the book of Chronicles, but it's not so clear in the book of Job. So I correct myself on that. But in the book of Chronicles, there is a story about David where it's told in the book of Samuel that God had enticed David to to make a census of the people, which for some reason, we don't know why, for some reason that was considered to be a bad thing that led to a plague. Research has been done in this. There isn't a parallel to this in the ancient Near East. In any case, in the book of Samuel, God does the enticing, but when the story is retold in the book of Chronicles, it's the Satan that does the enticing. So it's kind of distancing the bad stuff from the deity himself. And this is not against monotheism, because monotheism includes all of God's agents. And there are lots of ways of looking at the agents, right? The agents are the angels. And certain times, the angels were seen as personalities, right? That is, and in the Bible, only a few of them are named. But when you get into the later rabbinic tradition, you've got thousands, angels. You've got lots and lots of angels and demons, and many of more of them are given names in the later literature. And I don't want to get too much into contemporary theology, but some of us, might see people who do godly acts and act as agents of gods as angels, and certainly in our own parlance, we very often refer to such individuals as angels. Okay. Finally, I'm going to get to the question of, well, if God is depicted the way that God is, as being not perfect, not perfectly omnipotent, not perfectly omniscient, not perfectly benevolent, that's for sure not. In the book of Job, God is unjust in the book of Job. That's what the lawsuit is all about. How can God, be making an honest, innocent person look like a criminal? We're going to look at that a little bit later today, in just a few minutes. But in any case, how did it get into the Bible? How did it get into the canon? Why is it canonized? Okay, so now I'm going to tell you something that most of you probably haven't heard about canonization. And here I take the view of the late Professor Menachem Haran, who wrote a 4-volume work in Hebrew on the formation of the Hebrew Bible literature. But I can summarize his overview of canon very simply. It's not that they measured every work to see, well, does this fit in? Does that fit in? Does this conform? Does that conform? No. At a certain point, starting, I think, mainly in the post-exilic and Persian period, anything written in Hebrew that seemed classical, that was handed down, that was part of the heritage of the Hebrews, or the Jews as they became, anything like that was included. It was hard to keep something out. When the rabbis argue about what should be included, they don't argue about whether we should include this book or that book. They argue about whether we should be excluding this book or that book, and why we might exclude it, and why this book, like the Song of Songs, that seems like love poetry, or why should we exclude, the book of, maybe we should exclude the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, because his ideas contradict each other. Rather, anything that seemed to them old enough, if they knew something was contemporary, they wouldn't put it in. But if it looked older, and if it was part of the, you might say, the Jewish library, they tried to include it. Now, how did the rabbis view the book of Job? Well, it's one of 2 out of 3 books of wisdom that are actually unconventional, anti-traditional. You have the book of Kohelet, in which God tries not to get involved in human affairs. It's like the opposite of most biblical literature, where God intervenes and acts in history and in nature. The book of Job is also an outsider in terms of its theology. Nevertheless, the rabbis include it, but they don't necessarily take Job's point of view. Okay, you will probably notice, in the course of these lectures, or these lessons on Job, and reading my work on Job, that I tend to side with Job most of the time, right? And that not personally, but I think that the author, the book, I think is siding with Job, right? And in a certain respect, I side with Job, but only to a certain extent. However, the rabbis were a split. There were those who said we should not be judging Job because the man is suffering, the man is in pain. You don't judge someone's theology or piety when someone is in such a situation. On the other hand, That's like Rabbi Yochanan says that. But on the other hand, there's Rava, right, who says, oh no, Afra lefuma de dirt should be put in Job's mouth. In other words, he should be silenced. He should be shut up. He shouldn't speak in this way. He's blasphemous. But the rabbis overall, and many of the early Jewish interpreters, also seem to favor the latecomer in the book of Job, who we're really not going to say much about in these 4 sessions, and that is Elihu, who wrote chapters 32 through, or who is represented, I should say, in chapters 32 through 37, and in my judgment, and also David Klein's judgment, the late David Klein's, who wrote 3 very thick, heavy, detailed volumes of commentary on the book of Job. He and I both think, and some other people now think the same, but we're still in the minority. That doesn't make us wrong. That Job 28, the so-called paean or hymn or praise of wisdom in chapter 28 is actually the end of the Elihu speeches. The only difference is that Klein's sees all of this before Job's final meditation, and I see it as to follow all of that. Okay, how things got messed up there. There's a lot of stuff that gets messed up in the middle of the chapters 20, 24, 25, starting there in the book of Job. And I think it's because certain things were, the papyrus scroll was probably taken apart and pieces were put in. Okay, whatever. In any case, what I would like to do, I think I've answered most of the questions. Oh, one of them, also about, isn't it really the Satan who is testing Job and not God? And here I made my case last week. We read in chapter 2, in the second round, that God says to, as chapter 2, verse 3, the Lord said to the Satan, have you set your mind on my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth? I remind you that God doesn't have to single out anybody, singles out only the Satan among all of the different angels. A man whole in heart and straight of path, fearing of Elohim and turning from evil, and he still holds fast to his wholesomeness, so that you have tempted me to devour him for nothing. Okay, so who is the subject of devouring him for nothing? God. And if you look at the end of the book in the epilogue, okay, chapter 42, verse 11 in my annotated translation, it's the bottom of page 187. Then they came to him, all his brothers and all his sisters and all his friends from beforehand, right? Fair weather friends. And they ate a meal with him in his house. And they shook their heads in pity. Then they consoled him for all the evil that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Adonai, the Lord, had brought upon him. Who brought upon him all the evil? Adonai. And the Satan's not even mentioned there. Okay, so those are my answers to the chat from last week, and I hope it's suitable answers to any individual who might have written me during this past week. But I trust that that such an individual who is not happy with my answers today, or answers has questions about what I'm going to ask, what I'm going to say a little bit later, such a person might write to me again. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next topic, which is Job's lawsuit against God. Now, I gave you a reading. I'm not assuming everybody did the reading. Carol Newsom's essay on the divine courtroom. Carol Newsom, if you're interested in reading, somebody really interesting and of a high quality who writes about Job, she has a book that she published in the early 2000s about Job, which is an excellent book. I don't agree with it, because she wants to find. She's a better person than I am. What can I say? Carol, she's also a friend, good colleague, and Carol Newsom wants to see, you might say, the truth of the book of Job, right? What you might say is the basic principled messages or themes of the book of Job, not in the discourses of Job or God or any of the other friends, but in the dynamic among all of them. And I have to say that I still think that the poet is backing Job. But you know, the, Carol Newsom's view is worth worth the same attention as my view is. That's how I would look at it. I wrote a blurb for her book, and I said that reading this book makes you a better person. Not that many books you can say that about. Okay, in any case, I wanted to make just a couple points about Newsom's essay, whether you've read it yet or not. First of all, that the divine assembly itself is depicted as a courtroom, right, where God sits, with the various angels around, and cases are brought and are decided there. But of course, God is the chief justice, and God makes the final judgments. Carol Newsom also makes the point, which we're going to see very soon, that Job turns to the lawsuit, right, for a reason, and that is it's a last resort. He's not able to to argue with his friends using the discourse of conventional wisdom literature. That is the basic principles of just retribution, reward and punishment, that if you're patient, it will all turn out okay in the end, for example. That perhaps you're being chastised only, to give you a kind of test of character to make you, more solid and be able to withstand more in life. Nor so he doesn't take the path of wisdom discourse. He also doesn't take the path of prayer. He doesn't begin praying like what a psalmist might do. He also doesn't take the path of silence. All right, these points Newsom makes, these are all good points. But one thing I would disagree with in one of her claims is that she sees the lawsuit as a metaphor. And I don't see it as a metaphor. I see it as absolutely real. That is, from Job's point of view, he is actually doing his best to sue God, just like a well-versed lawyer would. And Job, we'll see a little bit later that Job himself was a magistrate in his own community. He knew the law. He knew how it worked. Unfortunately, God knows the law even better because God is the judge of all the earth, as Abraham says in Genesis chapter 18. So God will outdo Job in the end, but God does appear. And it's my claim that among the various reasons that one can bring for explaining the fact that God appears to Job in the end of the book is that he has to answer the lawsuit. Why does he have to answer the lawsuit? I will come to that in the course of the next few minutes. Okay, so now I'm going to put up texts, which are mostly my translation. Some of them are my translation before the published translation, and some of them are translations from elsewhere. So you'll see that I'm trying as much as possible to be honest, that that the meaning of the book of Job, is not only the way that Greenstein, has crafted it, but there are a lot of areas in which we all can agree. I agree with most of what Carol Newsom wrote, for example, and she was not using my translation yet. Okay, now we're going to try to share again. Okay, So I hope that you can see this. Job's lawsuit against God. Now, where the idea of the lawsuit comes from, I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Well, I could let's talk about it first. It comes from Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 1. By the way, you'll each be sent the handouts in the coming week. I didn't want to send them in advance because I wanted to be able to put my spin on all of these things and to present them, in my own order and everything. But you can have these. You don't have to take a note on every passage that I cite. In any case, and I'm giving you the Hebrew here also. In the right would you be, O Lord, were I to sue you? You can tell that I translated that. It's not your typical translation. Sadikata, that's you would be in the right. Sadik is the word that's used for someone who wins a lawsuit. You have the tzaddik who wins the lawsuit, and you have the rasha who loses the lawsuit. That's biblical terminology. In the right would you be, O Lord, were I to sue you, ki ariv elecha, to make a reeve with you, and a reeve is a lawsuit. Nevertheless, my accusations I will declare to you. Mishpatim adaber otach. Mishpatim are, in this context, accusations that I am going to speak to you. I'm going to confront you with them. And what are his accusations? Very similar to Job's. Madua derech rishayim salecha. Why does the path of the wicked prosper? Why does it go smoothly, succeed? Why are those who break faith at ease? Right? Rishayim, salecha shalu. Right? I'm translating Rishayim here as those who break faith because it doesn't mean those. Oh no, sorry. So, Madua derech salecha shalu kol bogdei vaged. All those who break faith, all those who are kind of treasonous against God's covenant. Okay, there you go. So that's the idea. But Jeremiah doesn't sue God, nor does Job at the beginning, and we'll see why in a minute. Now, the idea of suing God actually comes inadvertently from the first of Job's interlocutors, Eliphaz or Eliphaz. In Job 5:8, after Job has cursed the day he was born and the night he was conceived, then Eliphaz says, rather, I would seek out El. Before God, I would lodge my complaint. Ulam ani edrosh el. Ulam ani edrosh el. Very strong alliteration. V'el Elohim asim divrati. Now, those who know a little Hebrew know that sim divra is a little funny. First of all, because we don't have divra elsewhere in this sense. Sim is a regular word for pudding, but Professor Shalom Paul, I think I explained this even last week. Shalom Paul wrote an article in the late 70s in which he argues, I think correctly, that sim divra is a calque from Babylonian. That is, it's awata shakanu in Babylonian. Excuse me. Divra is in the feminine, just like awata, which means davar or word in Akkadian, in Babylonian. So this is also used not just of putting a word before somebody, but also of laying a lawsuit down. And so Job might be hearing in his head, at least subconsciously, the idea of making a lawsuit against God. Why would he make a lawsuit against God? He would make a lawsuit because if you bring God into court, then there has to be a response from God. And the response is going to have to be, what does God find fault with in Job? What's wrong with Job? How does Job want to know that? So, under the kind of ancient Freedom of Information Act, he wants to know what it is that I've done wrong. Now, we know that Job didn't do anything wrong. It's just the opposite. He was tested because he did everything right. Nevertheless, nevertheless, um, Job and his companions don't know it now, and they don't know it at the end of the book either. Only we know that. This is what's called dramatic irony, right? Where characters don't know what's going on, but the audience does know what's going on. Okay, and now we have one of the most powerful speeches in the book of Job, which is Job considering the idea of suing God from Job 9. Okay, beginning in the middle of the chapter. Since Eloah, God, will not restrain his anger, even the soldiers of Rahab, who's like God's primeval uh, um, enemy, the serpent that God had to fight with in order before being able to create the world. Even the soldiers of Rahab cower beneath him. How could I call him to account? Choose my charges against him. How could I do a lawsuit against God? How could I do it? Even in the right, I would get no response. Even if I implored my opponent in court. In other words, he doesn't expect God to appear to him. But if I would summon and he would respond, I do not trust he would hear my complaint. In other words, let's say he showed up in court. I don't think he'd listen to me because don't forget, he's both a defendant and he's also the chief judge. Why would he listen to me? He would push me on the hairline, which I interpret based on an ancient Near Eastern expression to mean to, he would deny my case. He would push me away and multiply my wounds for no cause. No cause. Remember, that's why he was testing Job for no cause. There was no good reason to put Job through all of those uh, disasters and afflictions. He would not let me return breath, for he saturates me with poison. If it's a matter of strength, then he is as strong. And if it's a legal proceeding, who can convene us? 2 points here. First of all, God is stronger than I am. So how can I stand up against God in court? And even if we got to a legal proceeding, who's going to convene us? Even were I in the right, his mouth we condemn me. Now he's getting to be very severe in his condemnation of God. In other words, God would incriminate me falsely. Even if I were innocent, he would wrong me. I am innocent. I care not for myself. I am fed up with my life. Try to remember this phrase. Okay, it is all the same. In other words, there is no reward and punishment, good for the good, bad for the bad. It's all the same. And so I declare the innocent and the guilty, he brings to an end. In other words, to the same end. This is the statement of Job that most upsets the rabbis in the Talmud, that he's denying just retribution, he's denying reward and punishment. While his scourge brings death to fools, he laughs at the trials of the spotless. In other words, they're innocent people, and what does God think about them? Oh, that's too bad for them. The earth is handed over to the wicked. He covers the eyes of its judges. That's another thing that upsets the rabbis very much. If it is not he, then who? Were I to say, I'll ignore my complaint, I'll forgo my sullen face and be happy. I dread all my afflictions. I know you will not find me spotless. I will be found guilty. So why should I strive in vain? In other words, what's the point of suing God? I'm not going to get anywhere. God is too powerful. God won't listen to me. And now he says one of the harshest things. Were I to wash myself with soap plant and cleanse my palms with lye, right? I scrub up using the best stuff that I can find, 75% alcohol rub or whatever. You would plunge me into the pit. So even my clothing would abhor me. It's a wonderful metaphor. Why? Because it is exactly precise. He doesn't say, you would make me guilty. He says, you would make me look guilty. I would wash myself with soap and I'd make myself clean. And then you would plunge me into a pit, into the mud, into to the sludge. So even my clothing would abhor me. You'd make me look guilty. Everybody around me would see me and think that I'm guilty. Now, don't forget, Job has also already been afflicted by these boils, terrible boils, Shin Ra, which is a curse in the book of Deuteronomy to the Israelites if they are to leave the path of God altogether. So he's already sitting on the in the ashes, which may be a place outside of town where people would avoid him, right? Like a leper. And now he says, you'll make people withdraw from me because they'll all think that I'm guilty because you make me look guilty. For he, God, is not a man like me, a man I could call to account, with whom we could together enter a lawsuit. If there were only a prosecutor between us who would lay his hand on us both, who would remove his rod from upon me, God's rod from upon me. In other words, stop God from using his power against me. So his awe would not terrify me, so that God's awesome demeanor, the very presence of God, wouldn't frighten me away. Then could I speak and not fear him, for I am not being right toward myself. So what is Job saying here? He says, I would sue God, except that in such a situation, I think that I wouldn't have a chance because God would be powerful. God would commandeer the proceedings. God would frighten me away. It wouldn't work. However, as Job listens to his friends and as he continues to mull over it, he decides, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? If only you would keep silent. Yes, silent, he's saying to his friends, for that would be wisdom for you. Pray, hear my argued case and pay heed to my lips' accusations. Will you speak corruptly to God? To him will you speak with guile? In other words, if I am actually able to bring God into the courtroom, will you show favor to his face or will you argue on his behalf? That would be breaking the laws of true justice. You're not allowed to take sides in a true case. Look back in the Torah, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, you're not allowed to take sides. Would it be well were he to interrogate you, my friends? Will you try to delude him as one deludes a mortal? In other words, if you continue to prattle on, defending God, and God doesn't see your points, he would reprove, yes, reprove you. Were you to secretly favor his face, he would see that you're not being fair. Wouldn't his eminence terrify you? And wouldn't his fear fall upon you? Your pronouncements are like maxims of dust. Your responses like lumps of clay. There's a lot of wonderful wordplay going on here. I can't deal with it, the Hebrew right now. Um, Keep silent, but you can look in my notes. Keep silent before me so that I may speak whatever may come upon me. I will take my flesh in my teeth and I will place my life breath in my hand. In other words, I'm not afraid of dying. I just want the truth to come out. This is Job's whole thing. He is committed to bringing out his truth. Is it the truth? That we have to decide in the end. But that depends on the theology that you come out with at the end of the book, and it's ambiguous, right? I have my view of what you should come out of the God speeches with. You'll have your view. I'll have my view of how Job responds. You'll have your view, perhaps. Okay. In any case, he says, "Though he slay me, I will no longer wait. I will accuse him of his ways to his face." Here I have to change there was a scribal correction here of my ways, but it doesn't make sense to accuse my ways to his face. No, no, he's accusing God to God's face. Here, I'm laying out my lawsuit. I know I am in the right. Who would argue the case with me? I would then keep silent and expire. Only it's worth it to me just to find out the truth, and then I could die. Only two things you must not do to me. Then will I not hide from your face. Put your hand far away from me, right? From upon me. In other words, don't use your power against me, and do not terrify me with your awesome demeanor. Either you summon, and I will respond. I let you, if you want to call me to court, okay? Or I will speak and you will answer me. But what does he want to know? It's all about this. How many are my crimes and my sins? My transgression and my sin? Tell me what they are. And then, why do you hide your face and regard me as your enemy? Would you scare off a driven leaf or put to fly dry tumbleweed? Then why do you issue a writ of poison against me? Job assumes that he has a bill of indictment against him that is poisonous, that is harmful to him and may not even be just. And take me to task for the crimes of my youth. The only thing that Job can think of is that maybe when he was young, he did something wrong, and God is still holding it against him and afflicting him for it now. You will mark my feet with lime and watch my every step and follow the tracks of my feet. Is this what you're going to do? In other words, you're going to follow me around, and every little misstep you're going to add one to the other. This goes back actually to what Job says in chapter 7, which is essentially, you can't possibly I can't possibly imagine that I did something all that wrong that you're punishing me for it so terribly. So, how can Job explain his suffering? Well, what if God takes all the things that Job did wrong, little of this, little of that, little of the other thing, and adds them up, and sum total makes something that's worth punishing someone for? And so he says to God, and he uses this again in chapter 31, will you mark my feet with lime, watch my every step, follow the tracks of my feet? Okay. Now Job has another problem. Okay. Let's say he wants to sue God, but where is he going to find God? He assumes that God is sitting in God's seat, right? This is in chapter 23. If he would let me know how to find him, I would come before his seat and I would lay before him my lawsuit and fill my mouth, typo, with accusations. I would know the words he would answer me and discern what he would say to me. Would he argue with me by force of might? Maybe not. No. And here I have to say, no translation has this right except mine, right? Because I took the inside of Shalom Paul. I found the place in the Elihu speeches where you have the same idiom, which is abbreviated, of putting something against someone, which is putting a case against someone. And I find it here also, because you have a preposition here that otherwise in Hebrew, it's totally mistranslated by everybody else. Okay. In any case, no, he would make his own case against me. In other words, instead of responding to my case, he would make a countersuit and he would find me in the wrong and he would preoccupy me with having to answer God. But there, at God's seat, the upright would have a hearing with him and I would truly get my day in court. But if I go east, he's not there, and west, he's not there, and north, and if I go south, I can't find him anywhere. Okay, so this is Job's predicament. How is he going to locate God in order to find lay a lawsuit before God, to summon God to law court? How's he going to do that? Okay, now in order to appreciate what's at stake for Job, we have to look at Job's ruminations about himself. This is the first thing he says. For I would rescue the poor who cries out. And I mean, it's not the first thing he says, but it's an important thing he says in the first chapter of this 3 chapter meditation, and the fatherless with no one to help him. I clothe myself in the right, and it clothed me. Like my robe and my turban, my justice clothed me. In other words, I justice was all around me and made it my point. A father was I to those in need. I would even investigate the complaint, even of someone I did not know. Someone passes through, someone goes near his encampment or his town or his village where it's not clear exactly where he lives. He seems to be a semi nomad. But in any case, he has all these flocks. They have to move from pasture to pasture. But on the other hand, he has a house and estate. I would investigate the complaint even of someone I did not know. In other words, I was a magistrate who went or who made it a point of finding justice for other people. So what has happened here? God has made Job look guilty by afflicting him so that everybody stays away from Job. So on the one hand, it's an injustice against Job. And on the other hand, he's preventing Job from doing justice to other people, for other people. This is a double injustice that God has done to Job. And Job brings it out here. Okay, now, how is Job going to get God to appear? The way that you do it in ancient times is pretty straightforward. We have it in Exodus chapter 22. It's throughout rabbinic literature. It's the first chapter of Talmud that almost everybody who studies Talmud knows, right? Two people find a garment, and this one says it's mine, the other one says it's mine. They each take an oath, swearing that at least half of it is theirs. In other words, when you have conflicting evidence or you don't have material evidence, what do? You take an oath. Here we have in Exodus chapter 22. When a man gives to another an ass, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to guard, and it dies or is injured or is carried off with no witness about. So this man said, I'll take care of your animal. Don't worry about it. But what if he was delinquent in watching his neighbor's animal? An oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them, that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. In other words, how do you know that the watchman, right, the person who was supposed to watch the other one's animal, didn't take that animal and sell it and make a profit? How do we know it was really stolen or lost or something like that? You take an oath. The oath is in place of an actual eyewitness or material evidence. So that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner must acquiesce and no restitution shall be made. That's the JPS Tanakh translation. Okay, and I'm translating the next part also. Now, what Job is going to do is very tricky, but he didn't make this up. There's a whole ancient or Eastern thing going on here. I'm going to stop the share for now. Hope we'll be able to get back to it. And now we're going to look at something else. Okay, oh, wait a minute. You don't see it, do you? No, I have to share first. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Looks like Egyptian, right? Okay, that's Egyptian. That is just an illustration from one of the many documents that belong to what scholars call the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is actually a whole bunch of texts that are combined together by modern scholars in order to describe what happens when people go down to the netherworld in Egypt. All right, so what do you see here in this picture? I'm afraid we're going to have to go over the hour a little bit. I'll try not to go over too much. Okay, here you see someone's heart's being weighed. Okay, and here you find the god of mummification, Anubis, with jackal and his head. Here you have watching over all the proceedings the god Osiris, god of the underworld. Here you have the god Thoth, god of wisdom, who is recording. I don't know if you can see so well, but he's got the scribal tools. He's recording the proceedings. And here you have the scales of justice to see if this person is a good person or not, whether the good deeds outweigh bad deeds, etc. And here you have two goddesses who are two aspects of one goddess, the god of justice and the cosmic order and truth, whose name is Ma'at. Ma with an ayin at. Okay. Now, what happens when you get down to the netherworld? This is from the spelled 125 from the Book of the Dead from the University College London website, where you can find a translation. He gets to the broad hall and he finds this whole situation, etc., etc. And then what does he do? See, your name is he of the two daughters, he of the two chants, Lord of the two goddesses of what is right. You saw them just before. Okay, and now what does he say? I have not impoverished the divine herd people. Herd, that is the people. I have not committed no crime in place of what is right. I have not known or explored nothingness. I have not done any evil. I have not made a daily start in labors over what I did previously. My name has not reached the office of director of servants. I have not orphaned the orphan of his goods. I have not done the abomination of the gods. I have not slighted a servant to his master. I have not caused affliction. I have not caused hunger. I have not caused grief. I have not killed, etc., etc., etc. I haven't stolen. I haven't done all these different things. Okay, so that's the Egyptian oath of what we call the oath of innocence. Okay, so what is he swearing to? He's saying, judge me based on my own testimony. And my testimony is whatever you could find me guilty of that's worthy of punishment and affliction, haven't done it. Haven't done it. Okay, now we're going to share again, and I hope we'll be able to go back to where we were. Okay, Job takes an oath of innocence, but it's a little shorter than the one that the Egyptian has to take when he goes down to the underworld. If my feet have strayed from their course, my heart followed after my eyes, and a stain sullied my hands, may I sow, but another reap. In other words, may I be cursed. Right? I sow my seeds, but another bird will benefit from it, will reap the crop. May the growth of my field be uprooted. If my heart was ravished by the wife of my neighbor and I lay in wait at his door, may my wife grind for another. I know it's not nice, but there is a lot of misogynistic stuff in ancient Near Eastern texts, including, I'm afraid to say, in the book of Job. Okay. May my wife grind for another, in other words, have sex with another man, which of course he doesn't want to happen. May others kneel over her. If I raised my hand against the fatherless, looking to my supporters in the gate, in other words, because I'm a big shot, right? I'm the magistrate in the town. I could raise my hand against the fatherless, and everybody would say, "It's okay, you can do it. You're powerful. We like you." I won't make any comparisons to anybody today. May my arm drop off my shoulder, my forearm break off at the elbow. In other words, may I be terribly cursed if that should happen. So, what does Job do in order to get a hearing from God, to force him into court? He swears, I didn't do any of the possible things that you might be afflicting me for. So, you've got to appear and you've got to give me the charges that you hold against me, because I can't imagine what else there would be. He's trying to force God's hand to appear in court. Very clever. All right. Job then says, this is his challenge. I'm reading, this is from the Tanakh translation, the JPS. Oh, that I had someone to give me a hearing. Oh, that Shaddai, the Almighty, or whatever means, would reply to my writ, or my accuser draw up a true bill. I would carry it on my shoulder. In other words, if you would just give me the charges against me, I would carry it with pride on my shoulder, tie it around me, um, or, like a wreath. like something seems to be missing here. I don't know. I would give him an account of my steps. I would approach him in court like a commander. So he's trying to force God's hand to appear. And finally, God appears. Here's the divine response. And I claim, and one of my very good friends, an expert on ancient Near Eastern wisdom and law and Akkadian text and Bible, the late Victor Horowitz, um, wrote to me, that he had the same idea, but I put it even better than. And it was biggest compliment, as big a compliment as I ever got in my career. In any case, unfortunately, Victor, you know, um, predeceased me. Uh, okay, in any case, um, he's a great scholar. I don't mind mentioning his name, Victor Horowitz. Victor Horowitz. In any case, in Job 38, God responds. Then the Lord replied to Job out of the tempest. Why out of the tempest? Because Job said, I would approach him like a commander, which the word nagid in Hebrew is like a prince or a commander in like a warrior. So God comes against Job like a warrior out of the storm. Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man, I will ask you, and you will inform me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions, or who measured it with a line? Onto what were its bases sunk? Who set its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the divine beings shouted for joy? In other words, do you know what happened when I created the world? No, you don't know anything. All right, now why is that important? It's important because the whole idea is that God, and you find it especially in Proverbs chapter 8, God revealed God's essential self only once completely. And that was when God created the world using wisdom as a guide. That's in Proverbs chapter 8, second half of the chapter. And so what God says to Job is, you want to make claims against me? You want to sue me? You can't do it because you are not a witness. You weren't there when I created the world. If you wanted to know me, you had to have been there when I created the world. And this is not just something that God says here. If you read through chapter 15, Eliphaz's second speech, you'll see that Eliphaz makes exactly the same point against Job. Were you the first person born? How do you know so much about God? Were you there when God created the world? Were you there, at the time when humans were created? No. Okay, so this is what God does. He finds a way not to answer Job. He finds a way not to answer Job by throwing the case out pro forma on a formality. Because if you look in the beginning of Leviticus chapter 5, tells you what is a witness? Someone who sees, someone who hears. Did Job see or hear when God revealed God's self at the beginning? No. Therefore, because Job lacks this special esoteric knowledge, Job cannot make a case against God, at least according to God. So God gives Job the benefit of appearing, and he speaks to him. And we'll talk another time in the last class, the fourth class, about God's speech and what one might make of it and what Job seems to make of it. However, right now, there is no formal answer to Job about what Job did wrong, and there will not be one, not in this book. Now, why doesn't God answer Job? That's a question that nobody really can answer except, by figuring it out on your own, based on your own reading of the book. Is it because God is ashamed? Is it because the test was only for God's benefit and not for Job's benefit? Right? Is it for some other reason? Okay, we don't know. We know what happened. Job doesn't. His friends don't know. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And if there is something in chat that I might be able to deal with, I can perhaps answer it. Do we have a few minutes left?
Ed, we have a few minutes. We're 6 minutes over. If people will stay, we can certainly do it. In the beginning, Rabbi Rubin agreed with what you were talking about when bad things happen to good people, and notice similar tension expressed in a high holiday prayer. Quote, since there is no advocate of righteousness to plead our cause, may you clear us in a judgment, O King of justice.
Yes, in the Jewish liturgy of the days of awe, there we actually have, and on Yom Kippur, we have conflicting ideas. This always bothered me as a student. I asked one of my professors at the seminary, and he says, "Well, you just have to live with the contradiction." That was Professor David Wolf Silverman. May he rest in peace. In any case, all right, because you also have this piyut or poetic prayer that God shapes us according to God's will. So we're not even power. Can't even make our own choices. So if we don't even have our own choices, how can we be punished for what we do? It's very complicated and it's not consistent. It's not systematic theology. Okay, that's my best answer for now.
Thank you. And the other question that we had is Rabbi Silberman, what is the source of the Book of the Dead? I believe it was. I don't want to. Go ahead.
This is one of several. Okay, there are several papyruses, sometimes in scrolls, and many of the museums that you will that you'll look at in the world will have at least some of it. It was put together at various times during the second and first millennia BCE. The text that I showed you is from a manuscript from 13th century BCE. But if you go to Google and just look up the Book of the Dead, you'll find various texts. But you saw that was spell 125, which means that there are many other spells prior to that, right? And there are spells after that. It's a bunch of texts. It's not a single work written by one person at one time, but it gives you various perspectives on life and the afterlife in Egypt. Let me just say one word about that. I apologize to those who've studied the book of Kohelet with me. There are at least a couple people like that here, I think. In any case, there is a well-known Egyptian text called, which actually a few texts, but one that's especially widely used and quoted, called the Song of the Harper. And everybody thinks, that, well, the Egyptians kind of welcome death because you leave this world and you go into a better life, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the way all the Egyptians looked at it, right? The Song of the Harper, and there are other songs just like it, is a lament over the fact that people have to die, and that after people die, very often, even the most famous, the ones whose words we use every time we speak, are not even remembered. Right? There's an injustice in that. So the Egyptians, like many others, right, have contradictory views of many things.
Professor Greenstein, I want to thank you very much. Everybody, I want to thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next week, next Sunday at the same time, same hour. We will be sending you all the materials that we looked at today. And if you have any questions, please send them over to me, josh@schechter.ac.il. You've probably seen my mails before. Thank you very much. Toda rabah.
Is there any new play? Thank you very much.
Happy Father's Day, and everyone who had a father has a father. Right?
Is there any new places?
Thoughts. May you all have pleasant thoughts. Take care.
Is there anybody knows a book to be available? I'd like to buy a copy of
Ed's book, but I haven't found it yet. Anybody have an extra copy around?
All right. Yeah. Okay.